Good evening, friends, and shalom, and welcome to this episode of the Watchdog. I am your host, CJ Cox, here to tell you that we are living in biblical times. Want to remind you guys that this is exclusively on the Synagogue News. Please consider hitting that like button and also subscribing to the Synagogue News if you're new here and if you enjoy our content. Excuse me. Hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. And of course, want to remind you to think like a Neanderthal. I can talk. Think like a Neanderthal, which is, of course, our little slogan here. I want to go ahead and just own those digs that the left tries to give us, because if you're not going to, nobody else will. I love that apple cider. Anywho, also want to remind you guys to please get this video shared out to all the different social media platforms which you frequent. Of course, what good is a message without an audience to hear it? While you are in the process of sharing this to your different friends and family and the social media platforms which you frequent and so on, please do consider going to alternative social media platforms, things like Gab, Parler, and Minds if you're on Twitter, things like, I don't know why the name fleets me, MeWe and Telegram if you're on Facebook. And of course, the big one for us is Rumble, because we do upload these videos on Rumble after the fact, especially since we do have very serious concern for the possibility of the show getting taken down at some point. So far, only one video has ever been censored, but we did get a strike for it. And of course, it was for talking about the coronarchy, right? And the bang bang and all that other kind of stuff. Our coded language has helped a little bit with making sure that that's not something we're actually getting in trouble for anymore. But nonetheless, if you're interested in this channel, or just for any reason at all, please do definitely consider getting on these different alternative social media platforms. It's the only way you're ever going to actually take back freedom of speech online, is by making sure that the companies are losing something, namely dollars, whenever they are actually deciding to go against freedom of speech, right? So certainly want to make sure that you guys are at least trying out alternative social media platforms. And by the way, if you don't consider yourself to be politically right-wing, that's perfectly fine, because it becomes less of an echo chamber simply by your being there. So if you consider yourself center-right, moderate, center-left, progressive, whatever it happens to be, these places, if they're truly free speech platforms, which in the case of Gab, in the case of Rumble, in the case of Parler, they are, if they're truly for free speech, and like I said, they're going to be things that protect your free speech as well. And you showing up there and speaking freely means that it becomes less of an echo chamber, right? And of course, you're taking yourself out, of your own echo chamber, right? Because nobody wants a leftist echo chamber either, at least nobody who wants honest pursuit of truth. And I know there's a lot of y'all who still want honest pursuit of truth. But at any rate, let's go ahead and get right into our pre-article discussion for today. Still don't have a nice pithy name for that, but that's perfectly fine. So I want to go ahead and talk today about recently, which numerous people have been commenting on and they seem to have a problem with, and which I don't know if I have a problem with, to be honest with you. And I think it's an interesting thing for us to talk about. So recently, I have seen a couple of videos from different speakers, different YouTubers, different political pundits and radio hosts and so on, right? Talking about the recent push of republicanism into what we might call a more progressive republicanism, so to speak, right? That is to say, we have been seeing, and let me just actually name the videos first, so that'll be, a little bit more detail for you. The first video I watched was of Todd Friel from Wretched Radio talking about a Charlie Kirk, Dave Rubin conversation, in which Charlie Kirk started saying things like, the Republican Party is the party of freedom, and we are actually seeing a turn away from people who think that homosexual marriage is a big issue, which is obviously something that's important for Dave Rubin, who is the person he's talking to, because Dave Rubin is gay. And he's saying, while I personally as a Christian don't believe in homosexual marriage, I think that we as the Republican Party have moved past the whole idea of homosexual marriage, right? And so that was the first video that I had seen here that kind of got this talk going. The second video I had seen was Doug Wilson talking about libertarianism. This one isn't as new. The Todd Friel video was today, but the Doug Wilson video is from quite a while back. I just recently seen it, though. And he's talking about why he disagrees with the idea of libertarianism, why he thinks that the magistrate certainly does have the ability to enforce certain moral laws that we may not necessarily think are the government's right per se, being Americans, right? Things like homosexual marriage, things like whether or not weed can be legalized, stuff like that. And his example was basically, you know, if somebody arrests somebody for smoking pot, it's the same as somebody arresting somebody for being drunk and disorderly. If somebody says, hey, you can't actually have a marriage between a man and a woman, it's the same thing as saying, hey, you can't have a transactional prostitute or transactional interaction with a prostitute or something like that, right? And that was sort of the logic that he's got there, right? So the third video I had seen, which was something that was actually brought to my attention by Nicholas Whitmer. And for those of you who don't know, Nicholas Whitmer is the owner of the channel Proclaimer of Messiah. He's also the one who did the overlays, including the one you guys are currently looking at, and the channel logo. So that shield with the superimposed Neanderthal head, right, and all that with the cursive writing of our logo, of our slogan, rather, and all that kind of stuff. He did a video on his channel reviewing a conversation between Andrew Klavan and his son, who is a homosexual, and Andrew Klavan is a professing evangelical Christian, where basically they were saying that even as Christians, they're kind of moving past this issue of homosexuality, right? And there was another video that recently came out because I started getting interested in this, but another video that recently came out where Andrew Klavan was basically saying, hey, you need to come out as gay. I think it's a brave thing to come out as gay. And you shouldn't be living in, you know, in the closet and all this other kind of stuff, right? So the general theme that's been coming about, which I think Charlie Kirk actually vocalized most clearly, has been this move away on the conservative side from social issues. Conservatives, and specifically I do mean Republicans, have actually been turning away from moral majority, religious right style politics and moving forward with a more conservative libertarianism kind of politics, something that was probably popularized originally by Ron Paul, but which definitely does go back much farther than that, right? And a lot of people, Doug Wilson and Nick Whitmer and 80 Robles, the aforementioned, oh shoot, I can't even remember his name now. One of the aforementioned, I don't know, been naming a bunch of people. I'm an idiot, right? But who cares? The point being that a lot of these people are Todd Friel, that's who I was thinking of. A lot of people are now wondering, what are we going to do as conservative Christians when the Republican Party completely abandons the idea of traditional marriage, the idea of keeping drugs illegal, and all these other kinds of moral issues that we have associated with conservatism for so long, right? A lot of people are wondering, you know, what would we have said in 2006 when a Democrat said, hey, I'm personally against gay marriage, but I don't think that the state should be involved. Or a lot of people are also saying, should we potentially split the Republican Party and have our own party? Should we start voting third party, in other words, or independent potentially? And I think the whole issue is incredibly interesting for a number of reasons. The first one being that longtime fans will know that I specifically have been predicting this since the inception of this show. Don't mean to give myself a bunch of credit here. All glory goes to God, right? Anything that any of us see, you know, our intelligence, our perception, our discernment, that all comes from God. But also the fact that we actually had the opportunity comes from God, right? It's all to his glory. All gifts are from God, right? So we do need to make sure we specify that. This is nothing to you know, say CJ is so grand. But I do want to point out, longtime fans already know what I'm going to say because I've been saying it over and over and over and over and over and over again. 2016, the Republican Party got in bed with a thrice married Don't know why it was hard for me to say. A thrice married serial philanderer who had cheated on every wife he had, who was married to a oh my goodness, I cannot speak today. Softcore porn star and glamour model who had openly provocative clothes at White House special events, a man who cursed constantly, who was greedy, who was vainglorious and magnanimous, who said that he had never repented for anything, who used the Bible for clearly political motives, etc., and etc., and etc., and etc., and etc., and etc. I mean, we could name him Donald, etc., for crying out loud, couldn't we? Right? And there's the name. You guys know who I'm talking about. It's Donald Trump. It's Donald Trump. And we are now at a point where exactly what it is that your boy has been talking about has come to fruition. The flower has bloomed. Okay? We're here now. We are at a point where not just politically, but even socially, philosophically, religiously, conservatives are like, well, you know, I don't know if I think it's that big a deal. And of course, if they think it's that big a deal, we've decided to abandon this particular fortress, right? This Maginot Line, we left this trench, to give a better analogy, we left this trench, we dug a different trench a couple miles back. We did that in 2016, and now we're sitting here in 2022 sitting like, man, I can't believe we're not fighting in that trench anymore. What's up with that? I mean, I literally picked up my guns and walked the miles back to the new trench, but now I'm going to pretend like I'm shocked that we're actually not there on the previous line. We're now back behind. When did these Germans push us back? I don't get it. Not to pick on any Germans, right? But that's to use the World War I analogy, right? You guys get what I'm talking about. We've seen this come to fruition in numerous ways, whether that was Kanye West being taken legitimately seriously in the 2020 election by certain conservatives, not very many, but certain. Whether it was Caitlyn Jenner and Kid Rock being considered serious candidates for senatorial election in Michigan and gubernatorial election in California, respectively. That's Jenner for California and Kid Rock for Michigan. We saw this, of course, in the fruition of, come to fruition rather, in the fact that Donald Trump was the first openly LGBT supporting president in American history, right? Even went as far as to fly the gay flag on the night he was elected, and all this other kind of stuff, right? And now, Clavin and Kirk and all these others are just kind of accepting that this is the flow of things and saying, hey, we're the party of freedom. We're not necessarily the party of conservatism, of conserving the status quo. Rather, we are the party of freedom. They're trying to take on a more libertarian kind of bent, right? And I just find that to be incredibly ironic. I just find that to be a perfect fruition of what has actually been predicted by this channel for a very long time, right? It's something that should have been obvious to anyone. You can't say we're going to identify our movement with a person as flawed as Trump was and then not expect the consequences, right? Be shocked when the consequences come to fruition. I just don't see how that's possible, right? But the other thing that's important to note here is there is a yes and a no to the question, are you concerned, CJ? Right? And on the yes side, I am concerned that people personally are starting to feel as if these are non-issues. Because for your personal life, they certainly are issues. But as far as legally, some of you guys may be aware, I do consider myself a combination of Burkean conservative and constitutional originalist, not necessarily one or the other, with some good old-fashioned American nationalism sprinkled in there. I do not see constitutional justification for the United States government or for any other state government to be involved in the practice of marriage, any marriage. I think it's ridiculous that I, as a heterosexual man, need to get a marriage license, right? I have to ask the government permission to marry somebody. That's completely ridiculous and absurd. So in a sense, I agree with people saying we need to not stake our flag on the gay marriage issue politically, right? Because I don't think that the government has a right to be involved in those kinds of decisions. That being said, I don't think the government has a right to tell you whether or not you can go call a black person the N-word. And I don't think that the government has a right to tell you whether or not you can go, watch some sort of a inappropriate movie, like American Pie or something. I don't know. It took me a while to get one into my head. I don't think the government has a right to tell you that you can't deny the Holocaust or hate Jews, right? These are all things that I don't think the government has a right to tell you, but that doesn't mean that I want that to be accepted on a societal level, right? In other words, there are certain things that while I think you should be free to do them, I don't think we as a society should be accepting of. I don't think that we personally should be practicing, and I don't think that we personally should be involving ourselves with people who practice these things. I hope I'm making sense to everybody, right? To me, the idea of making certain things illegal when the society itself doesn't care for the law or would like to see the law change is completely preposterous. I think weed is a good example of that. Doug Wilson recently said in this video I was listening to with him, marijuana's time has come. People want this drug to be legal. And I think that's an accurate assessment of where we're at in society. I myself am for legalization of marijuana. I'm quite open about that. There are other super stringent conservatives. 80 Robles is another one, right? Who likewise for legalization of marijuana. It's something that society has just decided they want to be legal. And there's nothing that the law is going to do to make it illegal, right? Except generate a bunch, or to make it, to enforce it being illegal, let me say. Because obviously you can make it illegal, but to enforce that kind of law, it just doesn't matter. People are going to buy pot. The states are going to ignore it and legalize pot in their state borders. It literally does not matter what the federal government tries to do. So, the people could say that these kinds of ideas are just ideas that, where things have come to fruition. But my point in bringing that up is just simply to say that if you have the law saying one thing on paper, but people are doing another thing, then the law is pointless and stupid, and it doesn't actually have any societal effect, right? You can put a whore in a hijab, but that doesn't mean anything, right? And so in that sense, I think that it's kind of ridiculous to try and strong arm people into acting a certain way morally anyways, with the exception of crimes against other humans. But with that being said, right? With that being said, that does not mean that we as a society start saying everybody should stay home and eat a bunch of munchies and smoke a bunch of weed and all that other kind of stuff, right? Because also, just because something is legal doesn't mean that we should all be sitting up here and endorsing it and saying that it's the greatest thing since sliced bread and saying it'd be awesome if everybody did this thing. Let's give it to your children and all this other kind of stuff, right? I'm obviously getting a little bit exaggeratory, but you guys, I hope, know what I'm trying to say here. I've been taking a very long time on this, but I think it's an incredibly important issue. And I also feel like I'm not articulating myself particularly well, so I keep repeating a lot of things. But nonetheless, ever since I got sick, I'm fairly certain I got COVID, to be honest with you. Because my brain has really not been functioning since then. I'm not sick anymore, but that foggy feeling that you kind of get when you are sick, it just has not gone away. It's been 24/7. But at any rate, back to the point. So I don't know necessarily that I have a problem, is what I'm trying to say, with certain manifestations of libertarianism in the Republican Party. I don't think it's worth our time to fight things like marijuana legalization or legal gay marriage. In fact, I think that we should be fighting for a different kind of thing when it comes to those particular rules. For example, localism, right? And localism that is not state enforced, right? But a kind of organic localism. What do I mean by that? Well, if the state has no right to get involved in marriage, then that means, hypothetically speaking, a polygamous marriage or a homosexual marriage or what have you could be, quote, legitimate, meaning recognized in the eyes of the community. But that's up to the community, right? Again, the state's not involved in marriage. They didn't legalize the marriage. They're literally hands off. Y'all do what y'all do, right? Which means you now have to go to some local church, some local religious body that has the authority to marry. And if you happen to live in a community where all of the different religious bodies are like, hey, we don't marry men to men, women to women, men to their second, third, or fourth wife. Men to women who are not the wife that they actually had before. Like, in other words, divorced people, right? Like, if you live in a society that's saying, you know, you go church to church to church to church, and there's like, sorry, we're not going to do this. We have policies against this, you know, read the scriptures. Then the state can't force you to have that marriage recognized by the community, right? And I'll give you a really good example as to how this kind of thing could work. If you have somebody who is promiscuous, a promiscuous woman or a promiscuous man, right? It's not illegal for them to do what they're doing. And in fact, I don't believe it ever has been. I could be wrong about that, but I don't believe it ever has been illegal to actually just fornicate, right? At least not in the United States. Excuse me. But we as a society, up until the last 25, 30 years, we didn't accept that, right? You could go anywhere that you like and try to, you know, hang out in the corner, and whether you're being paid or not, that's not necessarily the point. The fact is, people are going to run you off. People are going to, you know, say, hey, you're just not allowed to do that here. Hey, in this place of business, you need to cover up, whatever it happens to be. And by the way, when I say run you off, I don't mean like violently. I just mean in the sense that, like, when you have some people hanging out outside your store and you don't want them there, you just, hey, shoo, get out of here, right? Society didn't accept it. Society didn't accept it. I think that that is the way to go when it comes to these traditional issues, right? If you have local communities which are just simply not down with mass public drunkenness, with homosexual marriage, with polygamy, polyamory, pornography or pornographic images or anything like that, right? If you have a society that's just simply not down with those things, then the law kind of becomes irrelevant, doesn't it? Right? And I think that's where we need to be pursuing these different moral issues, right? We shouldn't be saying, hey, the state should get involved and tell you you can't have a marriage, you know, a homosexual marriage. We should be trying to convince people, you know, in the heart and mind, hey, this is something that's wrong. This is something that's not natural. Let's try to put forward an idea that is right, that is natural, right? And then start to argue from there. The bad ideas, I think, is the way to go about this. In other words, you can't find anywhere in the Bible, which says we are to legislate biblical morality. You can't find it. It's not there. You can look through all 66 books. There is nothing there. Now you might say, oh, but what about all that stuff with the Torah? That was for Israel. And y'all know that, right? But as far as a command to believers to go in countries wherever they happen to live, Edom or Ireland or, you know, whatever, right? There is no command that says we are to legislate certain things, right? Like our different moralities, for example. In fact, there does seem to be the exact opposite, even in the law of Moses. They talk about free will offering, free will offering, free will offering. You must give freely. You must give freely. You must give freely, right? I've taken enough time on this. I hope I made sense to you guys. But let's go ahead and get into the topic for today. It's a interesting topic, a lame topic, a terrifying topic, all of these different things. It's a damned foolish feast. For those of you who don't know, I actually used this in my previous episode. Otto von Bismarck once famously said in 1888, excuse me, that the Great European War would happen because of some damn foolish thing in the Balkans, right? And that ended up being correct. About 26 years later, some absolutely terrible thing, namely the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, happened in the Balkans, and that caused Austria and Serbia to be at war, and Austria-Hungary was friends with Germany, so then Germany was at war with them, which means that Russia was at war with Germany, which means that France was at war with with Germany, also because they were friends with Russia, which means that Germany ends up invading Belgium, and Britain doesn't really like that, so then they declare war on Germany, and you see how things just devolves into absolute chaos, right? And his point was just to say that the Balkans had because of alliances, because of the different ethnic fights, because of how just completely ridiculous the Austria-Hungarian Empire was and how useless and feckling that throne was, right? He was trying to make the point, Mr. Bismarck was, that eventually, because of the way alliances are set up, because of all these different conflicts, it's inevitable. Something's going to happen in the Balkans that's going to lead all of Europe to war. And he was right. He was right. We did get our damned foolish thing in the Balkans, right? Well, we now have, my friends, a cacophony, of damned foolish things all across the world, each one of which I kind of think is inevitably going to lead to some violence. Yes, each one of which I think will inevitably lead to some violence, which is why I've decided to call it a damn foolish feast. In fact, you could call it a damn foolish potluck. Take your pick. Everybody seems to have brought their own steaming hot meal, right? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We're only going to talk about two of the situations, Taiwan and Ukraine. But know that it's not just Taiwan and Ukraine, but also the Israeli-Saudi Arabian alliance versus Iran and Turkey, also Turkey and Greece, also the choke point of the Persian Gulf, which has a lot to do with Saudi Arabia, Iran. Also, you have things that are very, very problematic in South America with Brazil and Venezuela. Also, there is plenty of piping hot, damn foolish things on the table for you, my friend. Take your pick. Enjoy yourself. It's going to be a long stay. And so I want to talk about this feast. And we're going to go ahead and jump into China first, because that seems to be the one that people are talking about less and less. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here real quick. Just one moment. And you can see here on the screen, per NPR, China's ambassador to the U.S. warns of military conflict over Taiwan. Yes, China's ambassador to the U.S. warns of a military conflict over Taiwan at the exact same time that there is a buildup of Russian troops in the Ukraine, at the exact same time that Israel and Saudi Arabia are teaming up to fight Iran because of feared nuclear power, at the exact same time the tensions are ratcheting up between Turkey and Greece. It's a damn foolish feast. Damned foolish feast, excuse me. And I probably sound like I'm drunk with how badly I'm talking today. Anyways, I assure you, I am not drunk. Just slightly retarded. So this is from January 28th, 2022. That's today, by the way. And again, this is from NPR. Steve Inskeep is the writer. China's ambassador to the United States issued a warning Thursday. The U.S. could face military conflict with China over the future status of Taiwan. In the first one-on-one interview since assuming his post to Washington, D.C. last July, Kim Gang accused Taiwan of, quote, walking down the road toward independence, end quote, and added, quote, if the Taiwanese authorities emboldened by the United States keep going down the road for independence, it most likely will involve China and the United States, the two big countries, in a military conflict, end quote. It was an unusually direct statement about the U.S. and Taiwan. Observers say China usually speaks in more general terms, such as saying that the U.S. is playing with fire or something along those lines. Though Americans' eyes may be focused thousands of miles away towards a threatened war in Ukraine, U.S. officials and analysts have voiced increasing concern about Taiwan's ability to defend itself. This week, 39 Chinese military aircraft flew near Taiwan, the latest of several such demonstrations. It is widely believed that the U.S. would defend Taiwan in the event of war, though no formal treaty requires it to do so. Now, there's a couple things really briefly that I do want to say about this. The first thing being that I don't typically agree with the idea of interventionism. I typically like to say, hey, this isn't our business. It's not our fight. Let's stay out of it. And I'm not necessarily committed to breaking that trend in the case of Taiwan. But I see a very legitimate reason to get militarily involved in the Taiwan situation, and that is namely the fact that I think communist China is just as big a threat to us and the rest of the free world as Nazi Germany was to the free world in the 1940s and 30s. And I genuinely do believe that, right? I don't think this is a Cold War kind of scare, although you could argue that the USSR was quite dangerous. I don't think this is a Saddam Hussein kind of scare, certainly. China has already demonstrated willingness. It has already demonstrated a willingness to attack the United States in ways that are not necessarily violent, such as cyber attacks and mass doxing events. It has already demonstrated its willingness to provoke to the nth degree, knowing that its enemies aren't actually going to do anything about it. And to be honest with you, there is a part of me which thinks that the only way one can deal with China is the Winston Churchill way, meaning like a pit bull. You just get right up in their face and say, I'm sorry, you're going to have to sit down, or I am going to smack the hell out of you. And I'm going to do it again and again and again until you're bleeding in the corner like some kind of a sick, degenerate puppy dog. And I mean degenerate in the sense that they're degenerating, not degenerate in the sense that they're a bad person. I apologize for the grotesque imagery, but there's a part of me which believes that. There's a part of me which says it would be wise to have United States soldiers surrounding China at all times. Bases in Japan, bases on the Okinawan Islands, which Japan owns, bases in New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, Australia, the Philippines, Taiwan, Hong Kong, if we can manage it. That might be considered an invasion, but that might be one of those things where it's like you take it and then say your move. You know what I mean? There's a part of me which thinks that we should be making alliances with all the countries that surround China, including Russia. I think it would be fantastic for us to turn Russia against China. There's a part of me which thinks we should be embargoing all trade to China entirely, such that there is nothing made in China that comes to the United States ever again until the communist government is done away with. Part of me thinks that there's no reason to be involved in the Beijing Olympics. There's no reason to be friendly with people who are friendly with China. There's no reason to hide our animosity towards people who put Muslims, Christians, and Falun Gong amongst other political enemies in concentration camps. Okay? Of course, there is the other side of me, though, which does kind of believe this is not our fight. It's clearly a matter of Taiwanese sovereignty. We're obviously not Taiwan. Taiwan is not a state of the Union. It's not even a territory. It's not even a country we have a treaty with. One could argue that it's a very good way to get millions of people killed over an issue that really isn't an issue for us, right? And I can see that. And in most different situations, I tend to agree with that line of reasoning. I just find China to be that threatening personally that it causes me to question my non-interventionist values in this particular situation. It causes me to question whether or not I think it's worth it to take a stand on Taiwan and say, I'm sorry, you can sit down, Mr. and Mrs. China. You don't get to play ball in this particular way. The other thing I want to point out, though, here real quick is China is being unusually direct because they know that nothing's going to be done about it. China is firmly under the impression, and they're right, that they are more powerful than the United States at the moment, that they are in a better position strategically than the United States at the moment, that their allies are more powerful than the United States at the moment, and this is the most important thing, that the leaders of the West, especially the leaders of the United States, are completely incompetent and even contemptible. I don't think that just applies to Biden, by the way. I think there was a serious part of contempt, a serious part of the people who, oppose us that thought that Donald Trump was just as contemptible, and Barack Obama was just as contemptible, and George W. Bush was just as contemptible. In fact, it's probably just been getting worse. It was probably one of those things where it's like, man, Clinton's corrupt, but Bush is an idiot. And then they go, man, Bush is an idiot, but Obama wants us to win. And then they say, man, Obama wants us to win, but Trump is just all over the place. He's a loose cannon. And then you got Trump being a loose cannon. And it's like, well, yeah, he was that, but this guy doesn't even know how to say words. Speaking of Biden, of course, you know what I mean? And it's like each leader comes with less respectability than the last, it seems like, which in my opinion is not by any sort of a coincidental nature. I do think that that is by God's design. I think we're under judgment, to be honest with you. But at any rate, excuse me, that, in my opinion, is why China is getting so bold with this. It's why at the same time Russia is getting so bold. It's why at the same time Iran is getting so bold. There's no reason not to, right? America's weak at the moment. Our economy is weak. Our citizenry are weak. Our politicians are weak. Our executive is weak. Our legislature is weak. Our judiciary is weak. Our military is weak. Our intelligence is weak. Everything about us is weak. Our infrastructure, our natural resources, our ability to actually stand on our own 2 feet. It's all either completely obliterated or on its last legs, right? And collapse in the United States is literally right around the corner. And they know it. And they're ready to pounce. They are ready to pounce. What's the solution? I don't really know. To be honest with you, I'm starting to think that there is no solution. If I'm being honest with you, I am starting to take a somewhat fatalistic view of trying to just resign myself to, hey, this is all going to go to hell in a handbasket and there's nothing we can do about it. Obviously, we pray for something else. Obviously, we try to vote for something else. But I am starting to become more and more convinced as time goes on that civil war in this country, World War III, global government, all these kinds of things that we fear, that they're just inevitable. They're just inevitable. We can't do anything about it. And I don't like that. But, you know, the world isn't providing me with much hope. Though I just read that, sorry. Ambassador Qin spoke of Taiwan at his official residence, Thursday, where he welcomed NPR's team to discuss U.S. relations with China, the upcoming Winter Olympics in Beijing. He is a veteran diplomat who previously served as the chief of foreign affairs protocol for China's President Xi Jinping, famously known as Winnie the Flu. Qin arrived in Washington last year at a time of bipartisan disappointment with China. It's widely conceded in Washington that a decades-long policy of engagement with China produced great wealth for many companies, but failed to spark democratic reform. Obviously. Qin told us that any ideas of changing China were always an illusion. And of course, he is right. Stalin had a name for these guys. He called them useful idiots. You made China incredibly wealthy. You gave them lots of money. But did you actually accomplish any of your goals? No. All you did is create a China with more money. It doesn't really help anything. He spoke of the upcoming Olympic Games with pride. Quote, Beijing is ready, end quote. These are the second Olympic Games hosted by Beijing, with athletes and other players largely living inside a secure bubble to protect against coronavirus infection. Excuse me. A diplomatic boycott of the Games by U.S. officials has added tension, though only a few U.S. allies have followed suit, and U.S. athletes will indeed compete, which means that it's actually not a boycott, by the way. The U.S. announced the boycott in protest of what it terms the ongoing genocide of Uyghurs, a mostly Muslim minority in Western China. Qin rejected such accusations as fabrications, lies, and disinformation. He nonetheless asserted that some Uyghurs were terrorists. And of course, he's lying about that because he's a disgusting dirtbag who should probably have his head removed from his body. But nonetheless, he's going to continue to give the state propaganda, right? And the liberals are probably going to continue to eat it up because they eat everything that China gives them up. Now, one thing I do want to point out is that, again, we do see the neglecting to mention Christian persecution in China, even though that has been very, very bad ever since the Sino-Vatican Provisional Agreement of September 2018, and really even before that. But for whatever reason, Christians being persecuted is not very popular. People don't tend to care about that story. But Muslims being persecuted, that sells newspapers. I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about Muslims being persecuted. I obviously talk about Muslims being persecuted. But I just find it to be interesting that when it comes to the Rohingya, when it comes to the Uyghurs, when it comes to, Palestine, which is not even a real persecution, in my opinion, we're all over it. But Messianic Jews in Israel, people being persecuted in India, Christians, for example, people being persecuted in China, Christians, for example, Asia Bibi, a Christian, another example, right? Well, that's not really important. And some of the other smaller groups aren't really important either. Like what the Sikhs have to go through in India, who cares about that? What the Falun Gong have to go through in China, who cares about that? It's not very expedient for selling newspapers. Quote, the destination for them is prisons, he said, while asserting that others had inappropriate thoughts that others had inappropriate thoughts that they were being taught to change in vocational schools, brainwashing facilities. NPR correspondents have documented widespread imprisonment of Uyghurs as well as efforts to turn them away from their language and culture. NPR has also reported a security architecture in the western province of Xinjiang that is even more intense than in other regions of China, with cameras and police stations that are nearly ubiquitous. And I have a feeling that's coming soon to a city near you, by the way, if you live in a conservative state. I may be wrong about that. I hope I'm wrong about that, but I don't think I'm wrong about that. The U.S. has become more vocal in defense of Uyghurs as overall relations have soured. If either side hoped for a reset of relations with the departure of President Donald Trump, it hasn't quite happened. President Biden has yet to remove Trump's tariffs on Chinese goods, which is one of the few good things he's done. And U.S. diplomats have traded contentious statements with their Chinese counterparts. I want to go ahead and move on to our next article just because time is limited. And this is going to talk a little bit about Russia. So let me go ahead and stop this here and get my other article shared. And this was an interesting article, in my opinion, because, well, you'll see exactly why, actually. Ukraine's president lashes out at too much panic over Russia tensions. Ukraine's president lashes out at too much panic over Russian tensions. Now, that was incredibly interesting to me because the Russian president is obviously the Ukrainian president is obviously the leader of Ukraine. And he seems to think that the American and European response is overblown. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? Maybe it is overblown. Maybe this is us rushing to war far too quickly. Could that be possible? I'm starting to think it could. But I'm also not even close to convinced. So in other words, I guess I should rephrase that. I'm starting to wonder if it could, because it's just a very interesting statement to come out, right? But nonetheless, let's read. This is originally from Reuters. The writers here are Pavlov Polityuk, which I probably said incorrectly, and Natalia Zanets. Let's go ahead and read. President Volodymyr Zelensky on Friday did not rule out a full-blown war with Russia, but said Ukraine was not a sinking Titanic and accused Washington and media of fueling panic that weighed on the economy while there were no tanks in the streets. He spoke after Russian President Vladimir Putin said the United States and NATO had not addressed the Kremlin's main security demands in the East-West standoff over Ukraine, but that Moscow was ready to keep talking. And there's a link to read more here. Speaking at a news conference for foreign media, Zelensky said, quote, "There are no tanks in the streets, but me impression, if one is not here, that we have a war going on, that we have army in the streets. That's not the case. We don't need this panic," end quote. Quote, "I don't consider the situation now more tense than before," he added. But added, I'm not saying an escalation is not possible, end quote. He said the United States was making a mistake in highlighting excessively the risk of large-scale war, and that this was the message he gave U.S. President Joe Biden in their phone call on Thursday. You see how interesting it is to hear that from the president of Ukraine. Because nobody wants Ukraine to stay afloat more than the president of it, right? You would think, at least, hopefully. Some have accused him of being a Russian agent because some are incredibly stupid. But for those of us who live on planet reality, it definitely goes a long way that the president of Ukraine is saying, I don't think this is as bad as Western media is portraying it, and I don't think that the Western government's reaction is warranted. That seems like a big deal to me. It could be, I wonder, potentially this could be Zelensky just wanting to have the situation become less tense, and he feels like he can actually get something out of the West and he can't get something out of the East, and so he wants to try and talk the West down. Could be something like that. But it could also be that this is a situation that American interventionism and indeed Western interventionism in general, it could be another situation where we have made this worse. And that's happened quite frequently, hasn't it? Our overthrowing of the democratically elected leader of Iran in, I think, 1953, sometime in the 50s, though, ended up leading to the Shah of Iran. And the Shah of Iran ended up leading to the Ayatollah Khomeini. And the Ayatollah Khomeini is the reason why we currently have beef with Iran and why Israel currently has beef with Iran. And why Iran is currently forcing women to be in hijabs and persecuting non-Muslims, and etc. Right? We caused that problem with Western interventionism, in other words. The different African conflicts are famously not 100% to do with, but have a lot to do with the fact that Western European powers, when they left, kept the borders of their colonies rather than creating countries out of the different ethno-linguistic groups that were actually there, right? And so you have all these groups that shouldn't be living with each other who now are forced to, and groups that should be living with each other who are now forcibly separated. And so you get constant violence. That was caused by Western interventionism. And it does make me wonder if potentially this is another situation where we're very close to actual violence, but the violence is only going to start because of Western interventionism. Now, I tend to think that can't be the whole story, because obviously you don't just place 100,000 soldiers on the border of this country for no reason. You don't ask that this country be uninvolved entirely in your treaties, just specifically your defense treaties, for no reason, right? You don't say, hey, I don't want you guys militarily or financially supporting this country for no reason. And this is something that we have precedent for, considering not only what happened in Crimea in 2014, but also considering the fact that many people, including myself, by the way, believe that Putin, back when he was prime minister, probably orchestrated a false flag attack against his own citizens so that he could go invade Chechnya. In other words, not only does he have precedent for having eyes on Ukraine, but there's also precedent for Vladimir Putin pulling a lot of political strings to get what he wants, at least potentially. And I'm not convinced that the Ukrainian president is right. But I think it's an important thing to note. It was weird reading these words, I'll be honest with you. Because as I've said on the show numerous times, I think that Vladimir Putin's plans are obvious. But I wonder now if Vladimir Putin's plans are only obvious because we might have a jaded perspective on the information, right? I'm not, like I said, convinced of that, because it just seems to me like the information would have to be seriously in error in order for me to be convinced that Russia is not actively attempting to set itself up at the bare minimum for an attempt to invade Ukraine. But at any rate, while he said Russia was trying to intimidate and destabilize Ukraine, Kiev is propping up its Hryvnia, I don't know if I said that right, currency with FX reserves, as well as seeking military, political, and economic support from the West. He said the country needed $4 to $5 billion to destabilize its economy. including through foreign investments, welcoming 1.2 billion euro aid package from the EU. He says it is no Titanic. Zelensky said Russia should prove that it was not seeking a war with Ukraine by agreeing to an exchange of prisoners. But he said the most immediate risk for his country was chaos within, from cyber attacks to an economic crisis. U.S. and British moves to recall diplomats were a mistake and an exaggeration, he said. Quote, "We are no Titanic. Ukraine is moving ahead," end quote. He says NATO was the only guarantor of hard security Ukraine had in its standoff with Russia, warning that the military alliance's Eastern members might also be exposed to hostile tactics by Moscow. Quote, "This is a very serious challenge for NATO. Some European countries think, let's not take Ukraine in. But if a full-blown war starts, it will also take place on the borders of some NATO countries," end quote. And that's definitely true. It's not going to, be limited to the area of the Ukraine, even if it's just Ukraine fighting Russia. And the reason is because that's just not the nature of warfare, right? Every country that borders the Ukraine is going to have bare minimum refugees from Ukraine, right? If not violence actually spilling over into these foreign countries. And especially once you get down to like resistances, because a lot of times guerrilla units will actually leave their homeland and hide out amongst refugees or just amongst the regular folk if they can, in border countries. Hezbollah does this all the time, right? Hezbollah hangs out in Lebanon and then goes to Israel and fights. And then when they feel like they can't fight anymore, they go back to Lebanon rather than remaining in Israel. Why? Well, because it's just easier that way. Lebanon's not actively looking for you. It may even support you, right? What does that mean? That means that any country that borders Ukraine will have to deal with a conflict that is limited to only Russia and Ukraine, right? Now, the Ukrainian president seems to think that the way to go about this is not to panic, to build up soldiers, to put soldiers on high alert, to remove diplomats from the region, all that kind of stuff, but rather to actually accept the Ukraine into NATO in direct contradiction of Vladimir Putin's ultimatum. And that might be true. It could be that this is all a bluff, and that once we actually include Ukraine in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that the bluff will be called, and Russia will just have to accept the fact that it didn't work. I think that's somewhat naive, personally, but I don't know that it's somewhat naive. And I am certainly more interested in peace than war with Russia. I don't really see any reason for war with Russia, to be honest with you. We don't have long-standing hatred. We don't have the same hemisphere that we're fighting over. We're not trying to expand our territory into the same region, right? We could benefit both countries much more from an alliance or peace at the bare minimum than either of us could from potentially winning a war against the other, right? So I'm all for a peaceful solution to this conflict. And there's a part of me which wants to believe President Zelensky, which wants to believe that Ukraine is not under threat, and which wants to believe that the solution really is as simple as call his bluff, meaning Putin's, and let's move on to greener pastures. I just see it as naive, personally, especially when one considers what happened in 2014 with Crimea. In other words, it's like North Korea, South Korea. It's like China, Taiwan. It's like Saudi Arabia, Iran, or alternatively Israel, Iran, in the sense that this is something that has precedent set upon, or that is set upon, precedent, right? And I just don't know that it makes any sense at all to say we can expect peace. Peace may come, but to say we can expect it, I just don't know. It seems to me like what we should expect, what is almost inevitable at this point, is at least warfare between Ukraine and Russia. I don't see any other way to explain Russia putting up 100,000 soldiers on their border. I don't see any other reason to explain Russia's fierce opposition to the idea of Ukraine being a part of NATO. It just seems to me like Putin is planning something, and that something is military. I could be wrong about that, but I don't think I'm wrong about that. This is a very serious... I just read that. Sorry. If there is major war, it will not only be... I also just... no, I didn't read that. Sorry. If there is a major war, it will not be only against Ukraine, not only on the territory of our country. And, of course, there is a good deal of truth to that, as we had just previously discussed. He criticized Germany for pursuing the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, accusing it of prioritizing business deals with Russia over Ukraine's security and territorial integrity, which, to an extent, that's true, but we'll probably talk about that another day. He also named Britain among countries allowing money laundering by Russians, as well as by oligarchs siphoning money from countries including Ukraine and Kazakhstan, excuse me. That's actually the end of this article. So, yeah, I guess I've kind of already said everything that I wanted to say. So that's kind of an abrupt ending. And I do apologize for that. Like I said, I've been just super foggy since I got sick. So I do hope that all of my rants and commentary and all that kind of stuff is making sense to you guys. To be honest with you, I haven't felt very good about anything on the watchdogs here since I've been sick, nor have I felt particularly good about anything I've done on the unapologetics since I've been sick, with my last episode there being the calendar episode. And it's not, because of anything other than the fact that, like, this just utter fogginess in the brain. Like, it feels like, I don't know what it feels like, but it's weird. It's like waking up from a nap after you had just been drunk the previous night, except it won't go away. You know what I mean? And to be honest with you, I'm kind of convinced that I might have had COVID, which I don't really care about. It's not a big deal. The sickness itself was actually relatively minor. But, when people talk about like this long COVID thing, I think that I might be experiencing it at the moment with this cloudy headed kind of thing, right? And all of that is just to say that I apologize if quality has seemed a little bit low recently. We're trying to power through it, and I appreciate anybody who is appreciative of this information anyways. And hopefully I'm just only feeling foggy and not actually sounding foggy. That would of course be awesome. But nonetheless, I appreciate all you guys. Those of you who are here, I want to remind you to like and share this video. Please consider subscribing to the Citacog News if you have not done so, and hit that bell to get notified every time we go live. We try to go live Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. I want to remind you guys that we like to think like Neanderthals on this channel, and I want to tell you guys who are my fellow watchdogs that you always need to bear this question in mind. And this question is, in the face of Armageddon, will you compromise